What if the warning your brain has been sending you for years has nothing to do with forgetting names or misplacing your keys? What if it showed up first in the way you walk across a room, or in the fact that your morning coffee stopped smelling the way it used to, or in the way you grip a pen differently than you did 2 years ago? For millions of people over 70, the earliest signs of dementia arrive quietly, through the body, not the mind. And because they feel physical rather than cognitive, they get dismissed. A stiff hip, getting older, a duller sense of taste, just age, a subtle change in balance, probably tired. But neuroscience now tells a very different story. These are not random inconveniences of aging. In many cases, they are the brain sending distress signals years, sometimes a full decade, before memory loss becomes noticeable. Missing them is not just a medical oversight, it is a safety risk. And today, you are going to understand exactly what to look for, why these signs appear first in the body, and what they mean for your daily safety and independence. Before we get into the 5 signs, you need to understand one thing about how dementia actually begins, because it changes everything about how you interpret what you are about to hear. The brain does not deteriorate all at once. The damage that leads to Alzheimer's disease and other forms of dementia begins in specific regions long before it reaches the areas responsible for memory and language. The hippocampus, which handles memory, is actually one of the later casualties. Before it is affected, the damage moves through regions that govern smell, movement, coordination, mood regulation, and executive planning. This is why a neurologist evaluating someone for early cognitive decline will often ask, not just about memory, but about whether food tastes different, whether they have tripped recently, whether they have lost interest in things they used to love. The body speaks first. The question is whether anyone is listening. The first sign is one that almost no one connects to brain health, and yet the research behind it is among the most consistent in all of neuroscience. It is the loss of smell, and more specifically, the gradual inability to identify familiar scents correctly. This is not about having a stuffy nose or seasonal allergies. This is a persistent, progressive dulling of olfactory function that happens even when there is no respiratory illness present. You open a jar of coffee and something feels off. The garden after rain does not quite register the way it once did. Your grandchild's familiar scent seems fainter. These are not imagination. The olfactory bulb, which processes smell, is directly connected to the entorhinal cortex, one of the earliest brain regions affected by the tau protein tangles associated with Alzheimer's disease. A landmark study published in the journal Neurology followed adults over 65 for several years and found that those who scored poorly on olfactory identification tests were significantly more likely to develop mild cognitive impairment within 5 years. The smell system is essentially a window into what is happening in the deeper structures of the brain. What makes this particularly dangerous from a safety standpoint is what the loss of smell actually costs you in daily life. You may not detect a gas leak. You may not smell smoke from an early kitchen fire. You may not recognize that food has spoiled before you eat it. Each of these scenarios represents a genuine threat to your physical safety. If you have noticed that smells seem weaker, blended, or wrong over the past year or two, this is not a minor inconvenience. It is worth a conversation with your doctor, and it is worth mentioning specifically in the context of cognitive evaluation. The second sign lives in your feet and your stride, and most people who experience it attribute it entirely to arthritis, joint pain, or simply slowing down. But a change in walking gait, specifically a gait that becomes shorter in step length, slower in pace, slightly wider in stance, or hesitant before stepping, is one of the most researched early physical indicators of cognitive decline. Neurologists call this phenomenon motoric cognitive risk syndrome, and the data behind it is striking. A 2012 study published in the journal Neurology found that older adults who showed both slow gait and subjective memory complaints were nearly twice as likely to develop dementia compared to those with neither symptom. More recent research has expanded this significantly. A 2019 analysis involving thousands of participants across multiple countries confirmed that gait changes often precede measurable memory changes by several years. The reason is anatomical. The brain regions that control smooth, coordinated walking, specifically the prefrontal cortex and the basal ganglia, are among the same regions that govern executive function, attention, and decision-making. When those regions begin to experience the early cellular changes of neurodegeneration, walking changes first, because walking requires constant low-level cognitive processing that most people are entirely unaware of. Every step you take involves your brain calculating balance, ground surface, body position, and spatial awareness in real time. When that processing weakens, your gait reflects it before your conversation does. The safety implications here are direct and serious. A shuffling, shortened gait dramatically increases fall risk. Falls are the leading cause of fatal and non-fatal injuries in adults over 65 in the United States. If someone in your life, or you yourself, has noticed a change in the way you walk over the past year, one that cannot be fully explained by a specific joint condition, that change deserves neurological attention, not just orthopedic. The third sign is a change in how you handle familiar spatial tasks. This is different from getting lost in an unfamiliar place. This is about struggling with environments and layouts you have known for years, misjudging the distance to a step you walk up every day, difficulty parking a car in a space you have used for years, reaching for a light switch and finding your hand lands slightly wrong, bumping into door frames you have passed through thousands of times. The brain region responsible for visuospatial processing, the parietal cortex, is another early-stage target of dementia pathology. When its function begins to degrade, the brain's three-dimensional model of the surrounding world loses precision. The person experiencing this rarely frames it as a cognitive symptom. They say they feel clumsy lately, or that their depth perception seems off, or that they are misjudging distances when driving. They often attribute it to their eyesight and schedule an eye exam, which comes back normal or unchanged. The eyes are fine. The processing is not. From a safety perspective, this sign carries enormous weight. Driving becomes dangerous before the person or their family realizes why. Navigating stairs, curbs, and uneven surfaces becomes higher risk. The gap between perceived ability and actual spatial accuracy widens, and that gap is where accidents happen. The fourth sign is one that tends to be reframed as personality rather than pathology. It is a reduced ability to follow through on multi-step tasks that once felt automatic. This is not forgetting that you were supposed to do something. This is beginning the task and losing the sequence. Starting to make a meal and finding yourself standing in the kitchen, unsure of what you were doing next, even though you have made that recipe hundreds of times. Beginning to fill out a form and feeling an unusual mental resistance when the steps involve more than one decision at a time. The difference between forgetting a task and losing the sequence of a task is neurologically meaningful. Sequence and procedure are governed largely by the frontal lobe and its connections to the basal ganglia. These are regions responsible for what neurologists call procedural working memory, the background operating system that runs familiar multi-step processes without conscious effort. When those connections begin to weaken, the automation breaks down. The person feels it as confusion, frustration, or unusual fatigue when doing ordinary things. Families often notice it as impatience or withdrawal. The person stops doing things they used to enjoy because those things have begun to feel harder than they should. The safety risk here is significant and often overlooked. Medication management becomes unreliable. Gas burners get left on. Safety equipment in the home gets operated incorrectly. These are not forgetfulness failures. They are sequencing failures, and they require a different kind of attention and support. The fifth sign is perhaps the most overlooked because it sits at the intersection of emotion and cognition, and our culture tends to explain it away as grief, retirement adjustment, or simply the quieter pace of older age. It is a flattening of emotional response, sometimes called affective blunting, combined with a loss of initiative that goes beyond simple low mood. The person is not sad exactly, they are less engaged, less reactive, less curious, less themselves. Things that used to produce delight produce a mild, pleasant response at best. Things that used to produce concern produce a kind of flat acknowledgement. Long-held interests fade, not with a decision, but with a gradual drift. The neurological explanation involves the anterior cingulate cortex and the limbic system, regions involved in emotional regulation, motivation, and the generation of goal-directed behavior. These regions are also early targets of tau pathology in several forms of dementia, including frontotemporal dementia and Alzheimer's disease. When their function declines, the emotional and motivational architecture of daily life begins to quietly collapse. Families describe it as the person becoming a quieter version of themselves. The person themselves often cannot articulate what has changed, only that things feel different, flatter, less urgent. This sign matters for safety because it erodes the internal systems that drive self-care. The person stops noticing they are hungry or thirsty. They stop initiating social contact that would otherwise provide safety monitoring. They stop mentioning symptoms to their doctor because the urgency to do so has faded. The absence of initiative becomes invisible until something goes wrong. Here is what ties all 5 of these signs together and why recognizing them early is not about fear. It is about time. The brain has a quality that mainstream medicine spent decades underestimating. It is changeable. Even at 70, even at 80, the brain retains a significant capacity to compensate, reroute, and build resilience when given the right support. But that capacity is not unlimited, and it is not indefinite. The window for meaningful intervention, whether that means lifestyle modification, medical evaluation, safety planning at home, or changes in daily routine, is widest before memory loss becomes the dominant symptom. The 5 signs you heard today are not a diagnosis. They are a signal that the brain may be working harder than it should to maintain function, and that the time to pay attention is now rather than later. If you recognized one of these signs in yourself or someone you love, do not dismiss it and do not catastrophize it. Take it seriously, bring it to a physician who will evaluate it as a neurological question, not just an aging one, and trust that the earlier you look, the more options you have. Your independence, your safety, and your sense of self are worth protecting. And they begin with paying attention to what your body has already been trying to tell you.